Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl, Daughety, and we're looking at a passage from Psalm 67. Like the two previous Psalms, Psalm 67 is this prayer that the nations of the world would seek and worship the God of Israel. And it continues this pattern of thinking or linking the worship of God to a prayer for and an expectation of a harvest. It indicates that it could have been used during the festival times of Israel, as discussed in the previous lessons that we talked about. But this psalm begins with a direct link to the nation of Israel, but it does so in this unique way. So Psalm 65, 66 contain direct references to Israel, either by the details of their history or by specific religious references. The psalm begins with this link that is more subtle, though. It's a Aaronic blessing, this Aaronic blessing. So the Old Testament records this special blessing that Aaron and the priests were commanded to speak over the nation of Israel. You find it in Numbers 6, verses 22 through 27, and there is a popular worship song over the last few years that is built on this. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons to bless the people of Israel with this special blessing. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Whenever Aaron and his sons bless the people of Israel in my name, I will myself bless them." Well, in Psalm 67, verse 1, there's this similar wording and structure to this Aaronic blessing of Numbers chapter 6. It says this, it says, "May God be merciful and bless us. May his face smile with favor on us." So this blessing was typically reserved especially for the nation of Israel. But this psalm expands this blessing to other nations. The us in verse 1 is picked up in verse 2 and applied to the people throughout the earth. It says, "May your ways be known throughout the earth." Now, this would have been a pretty radical opening line for the people of Israel during this time when this song was written, to think that a blessing that had been given by God, especially for Israel, and was reserved for Israel, would now be expanded and used for other nations. So the psalm declares that the nations would recognize how God is personally involved in directing them. He's not only governing Israel, he is governing every nation. You can find this hidden clue there, how personally God is involved with other nations. In verse 4, it says, "Let the whole earth sing for joy, because you govern the nations with justice and guide the people of the whole world." This word for guide can be translated leading. That's what we probably would normally acknowledge it. But the Hebrew word naha is used multiple times in the Psalms to describe God's relationship with Israel as that of a shepherd. Psalm 77:20 said, "You led your people along the road like a flock of sheep." Psalm 78:14 says, "In the daytime he led," or shepherded, literally, "them by a cloud, and all night by a pillar of fire." Psalm 78:52 says, "But he led his own people with a flock, like a flock of sheep." Psalm 78, verses 70 through 72 says, "He chose his servant David, calling him from the sheep pens. He took David from tending the ewes and lambs and made him the shepherd of Jacob's descendants, God's own people, Israel. He," that's God, "cared for them with a true heart and led," or shepherded, "them with skillful hands." So we see in this psalm that this unique relationship between God and Israel is now being used to describe how God shepherds and guides other nations besides Israel. They're not the only ones. And so we have to understand that this insight would have changed the way they were thinking. And God is involved in everything, everywhere, all the time. We know that God is involved guiding the lives of believers, and even that he especially guides, protects, and governs his chosen people, Israel. But sometimes we fail to recognize that God is sovereignly guiding and leading all the nations of the world. God is in charge, period. Even when leaders do not fear the Lord and when we make decisions that are harmful for their own people, God's still involved. God is still somehow present in this. God governs the nations with justice, it says in verse 4. You see, the motivations of God for people are demonstrated in how he deals with every nation. Even when it might not seem to be so, God is in control of every nation. He is involved in our lives. So, Sheryl, how do we respond, or how can we respond to a world who might say that terrible decisions and events in various nations would indicate that God is not in control, rather than that he is in control?
I feel like a lot of the things that are happening and have happened in our world are a clear result of us not acknowledging him and us not following him and us not putting him where he belongs, which is over all of it, over our lives, our decisions, um, what we think is right and wrong, how we're treating other people. I think the proof that he is involved in all of that is the fact that we have not self-destructed yet.
Mm-hmm.
Because without him being involved, I think that that's what we would have done.
And there are things that we don't understand.
Right.
How he's at work. A few weeks back we looked at Israel being in slavery, or they are enslaved. And the reality was, if God hadn't moved, they do become enslaved in the book of
Mm-hmm.
Exodus. But if God hadn't moved them to Canaan and then allowed them to grow in obscurity
Mm-hmm.
into this big nation, we wouldn't have the nation of Israel. And then if they hadn't been put in slavery, they wouldn't have wanted to leave. They would have remained
Mm-hmm.
in Egypt because every life would have been good. They would have been called the Goshenites instead of the Israelites,
Mm-hmm.
right? But God allows these things over long periods of time to take place that we don't understand. And there are some minor inconveniences, momentary things that are happening right now that we can't completely understand why they're taking place, but sometimes they're a big part of a bigger picture
Yeah.
than we have any idea about, and all we can see is the suffering in this particular moment.
We tend to see things on a shorter timeline too.
A very
Yeah.
shorter time. Even if we think of it in terms of our whole life, that's
Mm-hmm.
still a really short
It
timeline
is.
in the context of eternity. Can you think of a time where you may have you thought, God, you can't be involved in this, only to look back and see how that he was?
I mean, if we're talking about current things, I feel like there's so many things going on, honestly, in our country right now where you just think, my word, what in the world? How can God be involved in this? But I don't, at the same time, the other side of that I see is that I feel like our society is no longer going to function in a way that would make it easy for people who are not true believers of Christ and followers of Him to blend in with people who are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it has been socially acceptable for so long to go through the motions that are no longer going to be socially acceptable. I think that, us feeling like the world is becoming so ungodly is also advantageous in that hiding or confusion won't be able to take place any longer. I think that it is almost becoming, I hate to say this, but almost becoming more of a black and white thing where it's like, well, either you're on this side of it or you're on this side of it. But I think that divide is becoming more and more obvious. It's becoming larger and
Mm-hmm.
larger. And the advantage that I see to that is that people who are going to be followers of Christ are going to be completely dedicated to it and are going to look totally different than people who aren't. It's like the wheat and the chaff, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
separation.
We live in a time where if we disagree, we've got to divide
Mm-hmm.
anyway. And
Yep.
the church is becoming the minority.
Yes.
I didn't grow up in that,
Mm-hmm.
but we're having less and less influence. It's not as obvious to people who live in our neck of the woods because we're somewhat isolated from some of world culture, or somewhat isolated. But even here, you can see the limitations of the church's influence. But if you go to major cities, like, it's almost non-existent now, and they ostracize you. If you believe this, I can't have anything to do with you.
Right.
And that's you have to be committed if you're going to, if that's the path you're going to take, and hopefully people will be. How do you think negative events can point people towards God?
Well, actually, the example I had thought of had been the Israelites, because I do feel that when we're in the middle of a situation where things feel out of control, or, we can't imagine what the outcome could be and that it could be good. If we point to a situation like the Israelites, so they had been saved, they've been saved from famine, and then they become enslaved for 400 years. That they thought they had been completely forgotten by God, and that there was no hope for them, that was going to be where they were going to die, that their people would die there in slavery and under persecution. But we know that God was actually growing and protecting his people, what would become the nation of Israel, and the foundation of our faith. So I think that we have to be reminded that things that can feel negative are still in God's hands. Sometimes the things that feel the most uncontrollable or that feel the worst are working toward the end that he already knows it. He already knows how these things are going to end, but he understands the means to make these things happen where we do not, because we're going to choose the easiest path.
That's right.
We're going to choose the least painful, the one that causes the least resistance, the one that's going to be the most peaceful for everybody that's included in it. And I mean, we can look back even at just the Bible and see that is almost never how things are done.
Right. There are tons of movies where people get some kind of wish or some time machine or something. They go back and they change one little small event, but it changes everything. And then they go, oh no, I didn't want everything to change. I just wanted one thing to change. But you can't change one thing without changing everything, right? And I think sometimes we go, gosh, I wish this was different. But if we didn't have everything else, then you wouldn't have this either, right? And if you didn't have this, you wouldn't have so many other things that you have. And that's hard for us to understand. Like, I wish my life was perfect. I wish it was easier. I wish it was peaceful. I wish it was the path of least resistance.
But you can't see the big picture.
Right. But if you had all of that, you wouldn't have many of the things that you do find joy and hope in. And I think we have to take it all and trust God that he's working something for good.
An example I was going to give is a woman. She's written several books and she speaks pretty frequently. But she, in her early 20s, had a massive stroke that has caused, debilitations that she's living with for the rest of her life now. She can't do most things on her own. But she has come to the point in her life where she says, like, I can actually say that I am thankful for what happened to me, because even though I would have never chosen that for myself, it has caused me to understand what is truly important in this life that God has given me, and what it is he has truly called me to do, and the ways in which she has been able to speak to and encourage people that she would have never had anything in common with
if she didn't have that.
Yeah,
I would agree. And I think we have to learn to appreciate the things God takes us through, because he does it for a reason.
And it's not only for you.
That's right. Sometimes it's for so many other people.
Yeah,
I would agree. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading.